Hi, so we're at Startup Live, and we're with Josh Becker. He is the founder and CEO of Machina, and also the co-convener of Startup to Startup. So, Josh, let's talk about why you're here and why you organize these lovely events.
Well, the reason we do the events, it's really entrepreneurs learning from each other, people sharing stories and experiences. I mean, tonight was a perfect example of that. The topic was about company culture, and people really shared. And I think, Dave Cashin really set the tone because he really set the tone. As people, what do you want to be doing with your life? And so much of your life is at work, and it started with a very profound questions I was not expecting him to start with, but a very profound question about what drives you, what impact you want to leave in the world. I mean, really set a very profound context, and then got very practical about practical things, that you need to do to create a culture. And I think we learned is, I mean, it's hard work. It's not easy to do. You have to really, and as a CEO, it's a reminder to myself of some of the things on the list we're doing, fortunately, but some of the things, I've been meaning to do, but we're not doing yet. And, one of the things he's talked about is budgeting. It comes down to budgeting the time for those things because it does take a lot of time if you really want to build a great culture.
And you have to be aware of it right from the get-go. And you just started your Lex Machina recently. So can you talk about that and how you came about to where you are today with your startup?
Yeah. Well, I just started the research. I was not actually the co-founder. So the company had actually been around. It was a project at Stanford for 3 years. So it was actually interesting. It's got an interesting history. It was really a public interest project at Stanford between the computer science department and the law school around bringing openness and transparency, the crazy world of IP litigation, intellectual property litigation, and IP litigation data. And so it was a public interest project spun out into a company. So it's been through kind of iterations. And so when I joined, there already was some aspects of culture there, but there are things that we've done, I think, to, that with the whole team to really improve the culture. But tonight, as a reminder to me, there's a lot of things, we still have a lot of ways to go. And so, again, I think that's what I took out of it tonight was very practical, some very practical steps, and probably some follow-up for Startup to Startup, actually. People came up to me afterwards, and Brian Weisfeld, who was the COO of Coupons.com, suggested we do a whole session on how to interview. Because that was one of the pieces, if you're going to great culture, well, okay, then you have to hire great, people that, not great, just great people, but people who fit the culture. And how do you interview for culture? And how do you interview in general? So.
And I think it's interesting, your background is in many different sectors, and this is not your first startup, an entrepreneurial endeavor. You've been an investor and are an investor. How do you bring the idea of building a culture through those different things that you've done in your life and also in your personal life?
Well, I think it's, I think that's why I think the context here was really terrific because it started, it really applies, I mean, ultimately, it applies to, so, I chair a nonprofit, I founded chair a nonprofit, and I sit on a bunch of nonprofit boards. These are things that cut across, these are not just, you want to build a billion-dollar business, I mean, these things that really should be done by nonprofits, by universities, it's really things that should be done across the board. So, in thinking about it for me, it's how am I going to apply this across my life? I think I've been fortunate to have a lot of different experiences. So I've experienced, as a VC, you get to meet lots of entrepreneurs and you get exposure and sit on the boards of many different companies. So you to some extent, you can pick and choose, say, oh, I really like that culture. Or, I remember, oh, this CEO did that. That was really great. I want to do that. So it's kind of nice now, for me now as a CEO, to be able to draw on some of those things. And I've even called some of my, CEOs, say, how do you work through that? So I think I've had a nice advantage that way. I know some great entrepreneurs and some people who built great culture, and so I can learn from them.
Can you give us a couple of people that you think have done that in your experience?
Sure, yeah. Well, Andrew Beebe, who I worked for back in the early days of one of the first stealth startups, the Springfield Project, which became Big Step, which got sold. He's now the chief business officer of Suntech, which is the massive Chinese solar company. But he was really phenomenal about building culture. Simply hired which is still private, but we're growing very rapidly. I always thought, Simply Hired had a fantastic culture. So Gautam Gadwani is CEO, but huge emphasis. I mean, you could a lot of just kind of company, a lot of bonding, a lot of events there. But those are two places that, and another, Nirav Tolia, I think is very good at building culture. So I have, I've just been fortunate to see some great people.
Yes, and I've always known you to be a very strong supporter of the entrepreneurial community, regardless of whether they're a social entrepreneur or a startup technology. And I think that's really great. And I think that from what I've seen, these kinds of events like Startup to Startup, it's the culture of learning. And how important is that to continue growing and learning as a startup who has an idea and is head down and focused?
It's very important. We heard stories here tonight about people who had grown companies that became 400 or 500 people, and but the culture had changed and became places that they didn't want to be anymore. And then they took that to their next company. They learned and took that to their next company and built a better culture. So, I think it's something you have to keep learning and growing. I mean, for me, I love being around entrepreneurs, innovators. I've been fortunate to help start some things myself, but I just love being around innovators and people, whether it's in the nonprofit sector or public policy or in private ventures, being around people who are building things, growing things, and have new ideas, that really inspires me.
It's great energy and it's very infectious. So one tip for other startups out there?
Well, I'd say, focus on culture, for one. That's the broad statement from today. And I'd say, one tip on that, I'd say that we discussed is you have to budget the time. You have to make it a priority. You have to budget the time. And then you have to learn how to interview. And you have to interview for culture. And that's what we're going to be in our next session on. So stay tuned.
Thank you, Josh. Startup Live for startups by startups.